Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, a big picture look at Canada's energy sector and the environmental activists seeking to undermine it.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Welcome to the Andrew Lawton Show, Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. As you've noticed, throughout this month, we've been doing a bit of a bigger picture look at some of the big issues that we've covered in the past year that are certain to rear themselves again in the year ahead. And one big one is the energy sector. We've had a lot of instability in this sector on a number of projects. We had the report from Alberta about the influence of environmental NGOs on the pipeline process and other energy development projects in Canada. And in the year ahead, we have a number of these projects that are still very much relevant and pertinent to Canadians. And I thought it would be good to take a bigger picture look at what some of these issues are, and also one of the big players in trying to expose and really tell the story of this sector, and that is the Canadian Energy News Network, a fantastic resource. If you haven't checked it out, you certainly should, and definitely subscribe to their newsletter. And at the helm of that is Cody Ciona, who joins me now. Cody, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here this morning. I don't know what it's like where you are, but it's starting to snow here in Alberta, so...
Well, I think that's like a regular occurrence out there, but nevertheless, we survive. For those not familiar with it, what is the Canadian Energy News Network?
So the Canadian Energy News Network is kind of like a rapid response research center. So what we attempt to do is we like to provide counterpoints to some of the attacks on industry. We like to provide some research. We have studies, articles, anything you kind of need. We have graphics, videos to help support kind of our industry's voice.
One of the big challenges is that voice just simply isn't being heard in a lot of mainstream media coverage. And I know that this is something that might sound like an obvious point to a lot of our listeners, but to the general population, I don't know if they necessarily know that. And it's really pertinent, I think, when you're talking about the environmental questions, the stuff that the energy sector is doing isn't really heard. And also a lot of the other two sides of the story sort of thing. We only hear one side of it.
Yeah, no, and that's very true. And it's, the energy industry is kind of painted right now as like nobody really trusts them. And I don't think really many people really trust many media organizations right now either. So I'm not sure if them actually being in more mainstream media outlets, I don't know if that would actually do much to help with that reputation. Because, you talk about, the Anglos have done very good at this. They've been able to paint the industry as, big, evil, big corporations, big money. And it's really hard to shirk that kind of identity, especially once it's been circulating here in Canada for at least the last 30 years, if not more. So
You raise a valid point there. There's a lot of baggage that is brought to some of these discussions. So for your job, as far as someone who's trying to right this wrong and someone who's trying to tell the other story, what do you find are the biggest sticking points? What do you find are those biggest points of resistance you have to confront?
are you talking about some more or less the attacks on the industry or resistance to, learning about the positives of the industry? Sorry, I just need to
Well, I think both. I mean, you're countering the negative, but also countering people that just don't know what the positives are or even that they're out there.
Oh God, I mean, for me being in the industry, it's kind of, it kind of just comes to me. But people still have this perception that there's pipelines tearing up northern Alberta. They still think that the oil sands are, this big, massive blight on the environment, and that's just simply not the truth. Of course, there's impacts, but there's impacts for all types of energy, whether it's wind or traditional fuels. So people still don't understand like the difference in impacts or the actual impacts that happen, which aren't actually as bad as the Anglos say they are, which is huge because they think, for example, northern Alberta just looks like something out of Middle Earth. When in fact, the oil sands have only disturbed, I think it's, and I might be wrong on this one, but 0.03% of the boreal forest in Canada, which is, Canada's massive. So it's not really that big of an impact compared to the, say, actual cities. So
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier the impacts on wind. I mean, you look at some of these reports, and I don't have the numbers handy, but just the environmental impact of some of these solar panel factories in China and some of the mining operations that are involved in getting the products necessary for solar. And it's not about whataboutism, because ultimately, if we say there's a problem and we need to fix it, it doesn't matter who's causing it. But it is speaking to that idea that people are only interested in scapegoating one particular sector. And in Canada, that's the oil and gas sector by and large.
Yeah, and it is. And it's, you know, if there's a solution and someone has a better solution than what the oil and gas industry is doing, by all means, we need solutions. We can acknowledge that there's, the human population is growing and there's going to be more consumption. We need to find a solution to that. And if that's wind or if that's carbon capture or whatever, we need to acknowledge that there's something, but we can't jeopardize the benefits of one energy source to only highlight the benefits of another one.
So let's talk a little bit about the ENGO factor, because I know this was something that came out in that Alberta report, which a lot of people kind of mocked the idea of the report, I noticed. When they started doing the investigation, they sort of just rolled their eyes and thought that it was just, I don't know, this right-wing fantasy project of some kind. But the reality is we are looking at a pretty significant volume of groups that are very well funded that really just seem to not be interested in creating or finding solutions, but just destabilizing this sector.
Yeah, it is true. I know there was a lot of heat around the conclusions. One of the conclusions ones, like there was foreign funding coming in, but they couldn't really tell how much because of the nature of it. You can grant and re-grant, and all of a sudden the money goes from one source to 20 sources. So it's actually fairly hard to track it and do an actual forensic accounting, which I know the mandate of the actual report changed a little bit throughout the 2 years or two or so odd years. But they still found $1.28 billion in funding coming in, not necessarily to attack Alberta oil, but there's still quite a large amount of money coming in from foreign sources. And that's just the stuff that they could track. They think it's much larger, which I wouldn't be surprised.
Now, I could be wrong, but I don't think you are getting $1 billion of funding every year, are you?
No, if I was getting $1 billion of funding every year, I feel like we'd be a lot more in the mainstream and be able to better effectively advocate for the industry.
Yeah, you might not be wasting your time talking to me, but again, the serious point of that is how do you and people like you who have a fraction of that money go up against that Goliath?
It's difficult sometimes. There is this perception that advocacy is a little bit siloed, but I think now we're starting to break down those silos between the different advocacy organizations, because there's hundreds of them, hundreds of groups on our side that are trying to promote positive message about the oil and gas industry and the necessity of it for Canada and the economy. But I think again, it's just one of those, people hear, oh, you're advocating for the oil and gas industry, you must be, XYZ, super heavily funded by them, AstroTurf, any number of accusations get thrown at us, where I think the environmental movement still has that weird term, but that angelic idea about them, that they're, trying to promote what's best for Canada, when sometimes maybe what's best for their ideology or their, funders.
Well, that's a really important point, because I do think that one of the cultural problems here is that in a lot of cases, the climate change alarmist position or the environmental activist position has kind of become presented as the neutral position. And everything outside of that is radical. So, if you think, oil sands are bad, that's the basic starting point. And then when you come in and say, actually, maybe they're not, you're the guy that looks crazy to them. So there is a cultural aspect here. And I know your pessimism in the mainstream media earlier, I don't think is necessarily misplaced. But there is a challenge of an idea that is, in many cases, radical, having become so mainstreamed.
Yeah, we saw that the other week with David Suzuki's comments. He's torn apart a little bit in the media, which is good. We need to highlight that, but it's not surprising that he said it. That's the thing. The people he hangs out with, that's a very valid idea. They're moving the window, the Overton window of, oh, sure, oil sands are bad. That's the starting point. But now they're moving it to the point where you can say pipelines will be blown up, and people are like, oh yeah, well that kind of makes sense. I mean, they've been doing all this other stuff, blockades and all that. It's not a big jump in their minds that they're going to start bombing pipelines. I'm not saying they're going to, but it's legitimizing that language that is kind of shifting everything around, much like they've shifted the goalposts for emissions and all that and other technology that the industry is actually trying to implement. So.
Yeah, and I spoke a few weeks ago on the show, maybe a couple of months ago, with some innovators and entrepreneurs that are doing a lot. Most of them in Alberta. I think all of them were in Alberta, that are doing a lot of work to recycle carbon and to try to find ways to make it into something positive, taking it out of the environment. All these things that government should be celebrating. But the theme was that the government isn't really interested as much in those solutions. The government has taken a very narrow view, which happens to align in a lot of cases with what a lot of these activist NGOs are pushing.
Yeah, there's a lot of reflection in that, and I'm hesitant to say that it comes from the environmentalists that are already in the bureaucracy. I mean, look at our new environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault. I mean, he founded Equiterre. He was Greenpeace. There's a lot more, I guess, communication on that front between the previous higher ups in the environmental movement and the government. I'm not saying that's officially what it is, but I mean, it's not hard to see where some of the policy comes from. Back in, God, it would have been January or February of this year, I had a piece in the Financial Post about the net zero bill, and it was pretty much ripped off right from I think it was an environmental defense document and a couple other NGOs. It pretty much reflected the same writing. So I had a piece about that, but they're definitely more willing to listen to that side, I would say, than industry. But I think they're starting to kind of get the idea a little bit. I mean, Minister Guilbeault was here last Friday talking with some CEOs. I'm not sure how it went, but I think if they're not thinking about it, they're thinking about the idea of it, which could be bad or good.
Yeah, and when we talked earlier about the mainstreaming of, what are ostensibly radical propositions, I have to mention, because I didn't get a chance to cover it when it happened, this thing, and you wrote about it, I think actually I might have learned about it from you, the Alberta NDP Youth Association had adopted a motion, and I just want to make sure I get it right here, supporting blockades of Coastal GasLink. And they said there's no Indigenous consent, which in and of itself isn't true. But this is, again, you could look at it and say, oh, well, youth association for a political party, who cares? But the NDP is the most viable alternative to the UCP in Alberta. So you've got, within the Alberta NDP, a sentiment that thinks, yeah, blockading oil and gas is fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think they've always had a little bit of that before before Rachel Notley became premier back in 2015. Obviously,
yeah, I mean, you'd think that being within arm's reach of government would make them smart enough.
Yeah,
but I guess not.
And I don't know if that was just a logistical mess up, or if that was I'm not sure if it came down directly from the head of the party. I'm not sure. I'm not going to make any assumptions on that, but it's concerning when a mainstream political party that might potentially be the next political party in charge of Alberta, when they don't understand necessarily the energy issues at hand or are ignoring them.
Yeah, so I guess if we take the bigger picture look at this, where do we go from here? Where is it that you feel the discussion needs to be for people that think what you and I think about this to start perhaps feeling a little bit less like we're on defense?
I really think, and this is unfortunate, but I think we need to highlight some of the energy crisis going on in Europe. I know a lot of the groups have been, but I don't think it's really been highlighted in the mainstream. Sure, we see gas prices are going up, and we saw the concern about Line 5, but I don't think people quite understand that, oh yeah, if something like Line 5 went down, that's most of the gasoline for Toronto International Airport, or that's most of the oil that goes to the refineries in southern Quebec and Ontario. I don't think people really understand that, and there's no silver bullet. So it's a lot of repeating messages, a lot of amplification, a lot of getting other groups like Canadian Energy News Network or whoever that are in the pro-resource, pro oil and gas kind of advocacy space to really keep hitting home and get boots on the ground, because you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily get it to drink it.
Yeah, and you're right. And I mean, a lot of the time people tend to, and this is, I realize, a political statement, but people tend to put a lot of emphasis on who's in power. And I'm not as convinced that that's as relevant here. I mean, sure, we can talk about the federal government and its attack on the oil and gas sector, but, perhaps there could be a more oil and gas friendly federal government, and then the provincial government in Alberta is not in alignment and whatever. I mean, my general approach to this is that the industry has to exist no matter what. And I know it, generally speaking, does have to adapt and does adapt quite effectively, but you have to find a way to work to swim upstream, basically, because that's the only option.
Yeah, and I mean, we like to say that the people affect the policy, and we do. Like that's the point of lobbying and advocacy. I mean, you get inside MPs, MLAs' ears, and you tell them about your issues. But I think that necessarily hasn't, aside from the last probably 5 to 10 years, I don't think that was necessarily the biggest issue that the industry was dealing with. I think they're keep our heads down, keep working. There's no way we're gonna be targeted, and there's no way we're gonna get cut off by the government. There's no way they're not gonna support the natural resource industry. But
yeah, well, there was a bit, I don't know if naivete is the right word, but perhaps misplaced optimism.
Maybe misplaced optimism, and again, that obviously goes to you gotta deal with the government that you have at hand, whether it's pro-resource or maybe not as pro-resource as maybe some of the industry would like it to be. So you got to kind of play ball, and I mean sometimes they're just on the bench straight up with political or policy issues. Sometimes they're just not even in the room, which isn't necessarily on them. That's kind of just how the government, it seems, does it. They kind of shake a hand and then, okay, we're not going to have you in the room. That's just my perception of it, and that's it's a big issue, because as much as it could be a communication thing, which the industry has been trying to work on the communication for years, it really does come down to the brass tacks of also lobbying too, and getting not just civil society on board, but officials on board too, the bureaucracy on board for the ideas of carbon capture or carbon recycling, stuff like that.
So looking into 2022, would you say you're optimistic, pessimistic, or still oscillating between the two, perhaps?
I'd say I'm pretty optimistic, actually. I think the industry is starting to see a turnaround a little bit. I think more and more people are starting to realize that it's necessary. I mean, you can't just get rid of it overnight, because quite frankly, that would cause quite a bit of issues, not just for Alberta, but for energy security in general in Canada. We just we don't have the infrastructure set up to immediately go to zero emissions or full solar or full wind or whatever that may look like in an energy context. So I think with groups like Canadian Energy News Network and groups like Resource Works out in BC, Canada's Energy Citizens with CAP, and I think once we get those voices a bit more amplified, because I think they are starting to get more amplified. I think people start understanding the importance of the industry. So,
sounds good. Well, the Canadian Energy News Network, always a great place, and I do liberally take some content for the show from there, and make sure to keep up on the newsletter, and I would encourage listeners and viewers to do the same. Cody Ciona, thanks so much, and Happy New Year to you.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. Much appreciated.
That was Cody Ciona of the Canadian Energy News Network. Like I said, a bigger picture look at some of the major themes and challenges in the energy sector. And I know we often use, just as a general thing, I should mention this, we often use Alberta and oil and gas in a synonymous fashion, which isn't entirely true. And a lot of the people in British Columbia, for example, who are so hell-bent on destroying the oil and gas sector, forget how pivotal oil and gas is in BC, to the BC economy, although it tends to be Vancouver activists, and Vancouver is not where a lot of the oil and gas workers are. But Saskatchewan, same sort of thing, a very resource-rich province. So it isn't just Alberta. And the one point, I think, broadly, is that energy prosperity in Canada results in prosperity Canada-wide. And that's why pipelines are national projects, because they benefit everyone in getting access to Canadian energy and reducing dependence on foreign oil. So I do think it's important to talk about these issues, and we'll certainly continue to in the year ahead. My thanks to Cody and also to all of you for tuning in. This is our last show of the year. We will be back next week with brand new, fresh 2022 content for The Andrew Lawton Show. Hope you had a great time with our shows in 2021. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, God bless, and Happy New Year.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.